Ever get that feeling? Like you're trying to figure out where the economy's headed, but it's kind of like staring into a snow globe, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with a place like the UAE, right?
Yeah.
So much going on, so dynamic.
Exactly. And you get all these reports and they're all pointing in slightly different directions. And you're like, okay, what am I supposed to take away from this?
It's easy to feel lost, for sure.
Totally lost. So on this deep dive, we're going to try and cut through some of that fog, you know?
Sounds good.
We're not going to be making any guesses or anything like that. We're going to look at some actual research.
Yeah.
And it's from the Emirati Journal of Business, Economics, and Social Studies. And it tackles a very practical question, I think. How do people try to predict where the UAE economy is going?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, right. And specifically, they look at three pretty common methods of forecasting. These are called ARIMA, VAR, and Linear Regression. Ever heard of any of those?
Oh, yeah. Familiar with those.
Yeah, so have I. But, you know, we're going to figure out which one has historically been the best. Like, which one actually works when you're looking at the UAE and you want to know if the economy is going to grow. We talk about GDP a lot. That's what we're talking about.
GDP growth, yeah.
So this is kind of your cheat sheet. You know, like we're going to go through the strengths and weaknesses of each of these approaches without, you needing to go and get a degree in econometrics or something.
That's the idea. We'll break it down.
Yeah. So it's like we're saying, hey, which of these crystal balls actually gives you the clearest picture of what's going on? Have you ever wondered how people even try to predict where a country's economy is heading?
I think that's a really good question. You hear these forecasts all the time.
You do, right.
And it's like, where does that even come from?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're looking at today. So we got to start with the basics. We keep saying GDP. What is it, and why do we even care about forecasting it?
Okay, so GDP, right? Gross domestic product. It's basically the total value of everything.
Yeah.
Everything, goods and services. That's produced within a country over a specific period. Usually we talk about a year, annually. And the article brings in Menkyu.
Oh, yeah.
Big name in economics, right? Yeah. And his definition really highlights that it's this comprehensive measure of a nation's economic activity.
Okay, so it's like the grand total of everything the UAE makes in a year.
Pretty much, yeah.
Makes sense. But why do we want to predict it? Like, what's the point? What's the real world, impact of getting this right?
Okay, well, there are tons of reasons, actually. Businesses use it, right? They need to make decisions about investments. Should we expand? Should we hold back?
Sure.
Governments use it for policy planning, figuring out budgets. Even central banks, they use it in their models to kind of understand how the overall economy is doing. It's kind of like, you think about a weather forecast, right?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone wants to know, is it going to be rainy? Is it going to be sunny? So they can, bring an umbrella or wear shorts.
Makes sense. Same with the economy, right?
Exactly.
So this research, they looked at three main ways to try to forecast GDP in the UAE, right? ARIMA, VOR, and linear regression. Can we just get a basic overview of each of these?
Yeah.
Let's do that. Okay, so starting with ARIMA, what is that?
Okay, ARIMA, it stands for Autoregressive Integrated Moving Average.
Okay.
Bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's looking at past GDP data to try and predict the future. So it's saying, hey, based on what GDP has done, in the UAE over the last however many years, what's it going to do next? It focuses on the history of that one variable. It's often used as a benchmark because it's relatively simple.
Okay.
Now, the AR part, right, autoaggressive, that means it looks at how past values of GDP influence the future values. The I, the integrated part, well, that involves a process called differencing, and we don't need to get too technical there.
No.
But it essentially makes sure that the data's statistical properties are consistent over time. The average level and the variability aren't constantly changing.
Sure.
And then NA, the moving average part, well, that looks at past errors the model's made in its predictions. How far off was it? And it tries to learn from those mistakes.
Okay, so it's kind of like saying, hey, based on the history of the UAE's economy, where is it likely headed?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And it mentions some other researchers like Yalma and Abdullah Ghazo. They've used this for other countries, right? Like China and Jordan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been used in a lot of different economic contexts.
Okay, so next up is VAR.
Yeah.
Vector autoregression. And this one sounds like it's a little bit more interconnected.
It is, yeah. It takes a broader view. So VAR models, they don't just look at GDP on its own. They look at how GDP interacts with other economic factors.
Mm.
And they do this all at the same time, simultaneously. So it's like a system, right? A system of equations. And each variable in that system, including GDP, it depends not just on its own past, but on the past of all these other variables.
So it's really looking at the whole, network of economic relationships all at once.
Yeah, the whole web, how everything is connected.
So what kind of other factors are we talking about here?
Well, some common ones would be CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which tells us about inflation and unemployment rates.
Right.
You could even look at different parts of GDP itself, like how much consumers are spending or how much the government's investing.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of flexibility there. The article even mentions how the World Bank used a VAR model to try and forecast Moldova's GDP. And they included data from Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Wow.
Because those economies are connected.
Right.
So it shows you how interconnected things can be.
Yeah. So it's trying to capture those knock-on effects, like if something happens in one place.
Absolutely, the ripple effects.
And then the third method is linear regression.
Right.
I think most of us have probably heard of that. We have a basic idea.
Yeah, it's a pretty common statistical technique.
So how does it work for GDP forecasting?
Okay, so linear regression, it tries to find these statistical relationships between GDP, what we're trying to predict, and other economic variables. The idea is that these other variables might influence GDP, right?
Yeah.
So it's like saying, hey, if we know that these other things are going to move in a certain way, then we can use that to predict where GDP is going to go.
Okay, so if we know that, I don't know, oil prices are going to go up or something like that.
Exactly. And the article mentions Ziwan Chen. He did some research where he included things like population growth and investment levels in his model.
So he was looking at all these factors that could potentially affect GDP.
Yeah, trying to build that statistical relationship.
Okay, so those are our three contenders. ARIMA, looking at the history, VAR, the interconnected one, and then linear regression. We're trying to find those relationships. So how did the researchers actually use these with the UAE? What kind of data did they have?
Okay, so they had a ton of data, like a huge amount. They had 426 different variables that they could look at.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and these came from a whole bunch of sources. They had data from Property Finder Dubai, the Statistics Center of Abu Dhabi. They had financial data from Bloomberg, information from the Central Bank of the UAE, and global figures from the World Bank. It was really comprehensive.
Okay, so they were really trying to capture, the full picture of the UAE's economy.
Yeah, all the different aspects, as much as they could.
Okay. And I guess because they had all these different sources, they had to focus on annual data, right?
Right, annual GDP data. So they were looking at how GDP changed from one year to the next, and then trying to predict what it would be in the following year, or even 5 years into the future.
Okay, so 1 year and 5 year forecasts. That's a big difference though, right?
It is, yeah. Short-term versus long-term.
And they use something called a rolling forecast approach, right?
Right.
What does that mean?
Okay, so imagine you're sitting there at the end of 2013,
Okay.
and you have all the data up to that point.
Yeah.
You use one of these models, right, to forecast what GDP is going to be in 2014. That's the 1 year forecast. Or for the years 2014 to 2018, that's the 5 year forecast.
Okay.
Now, once the real GDP data for 2014 becomes available, you move your starting point forward.
Oh, okay.
So now you include 2014's data and you reforecast for 2015 or 2015 to 2019.
So you're constantly updating the model with new information.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And they did this over and over again for their whole testing period.
So it's not just a one-time prediction. They're really seeing how it adapts over time.
Exactly. And that gives you a much better idea of how the model actually performs in a real-world scenario.
Right, because economists are always getting new data.
All the time.
They have to adjust their forecasts. So this is a more realistic way to test it.
More realistic, yeah.
Okay, so after all that, number crunching, what did they find? Which one actually works the best in the UAE?
Okay, so let's start with the long-term view.
Okay.
The 5 year forecasts.
Okay.
What they found was pretty clearly that the ARIMA model, specifically, they call it the ARIMA 121 specification.
Okay.
But that one was the most accurate over these longer periods.
Interesting.
And they used something called the mean absolute percentage error, or MPE.
MAPE.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But basically, think of it as the average percentage difference between what the model predicted and what the actual GDP was.
Okay.
And for this specific ARIMA model, that MPE was about 5.2%. So,
Wow.
not perfect, but pretty good.
So when you're looking 5 years out, the ARIMA, just looking at the past data, seems to be the most reliable.
Yeah, that's what they found.
Okay. What about short term, the one-year forecasts?
Okay, so for the short term, the picture changes a bit. The linear regression models, they performed really well.
Oh,
But there's a catch.
what's the catch?
They only performed well when they were given accurate forecasts for those other economic variables, those exogenous factors we talked about before.
Yeah.
Things like oil prices or global trade.
Oh, right, right. So they needed good predictions for those things in order for their own predictions to be good.
Exactly. It's like, garbage in, garbage out.
Right, right.
So when they had good forecasts for those other factors, the linear regression model was really accurate. Like their MAPE for one of their models was only 3.3%.
Wow, that is good.
Yeah, really good. But they also wanted to see what would happen if they didn't have those perfect predictions.
Right.
So they used a pretty simple method, just a 5-year moving average,
Okay.
to forecast those other variables. And then they plugged those forecasts into the linear regression model.
Okay.
And guess what?
What happened?
The accuracy dropped significantly.
Oh, so it really relies on those predictions for other factors being good.
It does, yeah. It shows you that the model is only as good as the information you put into it.
Okay. And what about VAR? Like, where did that fit in? How did it do compared to those two?
So VAR, it did okay. Like
Yep.
It was decent in terms of accuracy, but it wasn't as consistent as the ARIMA model for the long-term forecasts or the linear regression model when it had good information for the short-term forecasts.
Okay.
Its MBE values were kind of all over the place, meaning sometimes it was pretty accurate, sometimes it wasn't.
Okay.
One interesting thing, though, for the 5-year forecasts, the VAR model that looked back 2 years, they call that VAR2.
Okay.
That one generally did better than the one that only looked back 1 year, VAR1.
Mm-hmm.
But for the 1-year forecasts, it was the other way around. VAR1 was a little better, but overall, VAR wasn't as reliable as the other two.
Oh, okay. So even though it captures that interconnectedness, it didn't necessarily translate into better forecasts.
Not in this case, no.
Okay. Now we got to talk about something big that happened, right?
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah, that was a big one.
COVID.
Right. Nobody saw that coming.
Nobody saw that coming. So how did the models do with that? Like, nobody could have predicted it perfectly, but how did they handle that shock to the system?
It's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
And the researchers looked at this, how the models responded to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was interesting. The ARIMA model, because it was focused on the long-term trend, it actually did okay.
Really?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it probably didn't predict the huge drop in 2020 very accurately, but it kind of stayed on a path that was closer to the recovery that happened after.
So because it was looking at the long term, it wasn't as thrown off by that sudden change.
Yeah. It's like it was looking at the bigger picture.
Interesting.
And the researchers even said, this is something that needs more research. Like, did the pandemic actually change the long-term trend of the UAE's economy?
Yeah. Did it fundamentally change things?
Exactly. If it did, then we might need to adjust our models to account for that.
So economic forecasting, it's not just like a one-time thing. It's constantly evolving.
Absolutely. Always adapting.
Okay, so taking all this together, what's the takeaway? Like, if someone in the UAE is interested in forecasting GDP, what should they do?
Well, I think the study gives us some pretty good advice. For a short-term forecast, if you're looking just a year ahead, the linear regression models can be very good.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but, you got to have a good way to predict those other variables, right?
Sorry.
Those other factors that feed into the model. If you have a good idea of where oil prices are going or what's happening with global trade, then linear regression can be really accurate.
Okay, so short term, if you have good data for those other things, linear regression.
Yeah.
What about long term?
So for the long term, 3 to 5 years out, the study suggests that ARIMA is probably the way to go. 'Cause
Okay.
It's been the most consistent in the UAE.
So different tools for different jobs.
Okay.
The researchers also had some ideas about, like, where future research should go, right?
Yeah, they did.
What were some of those?
Well, they said that people should try other models, more sophisticated ones, things like LSTM networks, which are a type of neural network, principal component analysis, or PCA, and all sorts of machine learning approaches.
Oh, yeah, machine learning is a hot topic.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
They also said we should look at variations of the models they studied, like ARIMAX, which includes those external variables,
Yeah.
BRX, Bayesian VARs, linear VARs. Like there's a whole world of models out there.
So it's like the search for the perfect crystal ball is ongoing, right?
Absolutely.
And they also said it's important to figure out, like, at what point does one model become better than another? You know, like, how far out are we looking?
Yeah.
And also, how quickly do they adapt to big changes like, the pandemic?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so the takeaway here isn't that we found the one perfect way to predict GDP, right? It's that we have all these different tools, and we need to understand, like, when to use them and what their limitations are.
Exactly. It's about knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each approach.
And this has been a pretty deep dive, I think.
It has, yeah.
Much more nuanced than just reading a headline about the economy.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to it than that.
So here's a final thought. Given how much some of these models, like that linear regression one, depend on having accurate predictions for all those other factors, oil prices, global trade, all that stuff, what do you think are the biggest challenges in actually predicting those things?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. I mean, you're talking about, like, the whole global economy, right?
Right.
And how everything's connected.
It's a complex system.
It is.
So we encourage you to think about that. Like, how do we predict the things that are going to affect the UAE's economy in the future?
It's something to ponder, for sure.
And think about those three approaches we talked about: ARIMA, VAR, and linear regression. How might they be used in the real world?
Lots of potential applications.
And as always, we want to hear from you. If you have any insights, any questions, anything to add to the conversation, please let us know. This is a journey we're all on together, right?
We're all learning as we go.